Welcome to the show. Hello, how are you doing? Thank you so much for watching. This is the Political Space on RTV. Thank you so much for watching from Rwanda and all over the world. We have invited a number of experts in media, and today we are talking about media in politics, and we'll have a special focus on the BBC documentary, Rwanda's Untold Story. I'll go through their biography very shortly. Gentlemen, thank you so much for attending. We are so pleased to have you here. And I have Mr. Kaitana Charles, the lecturer in business and economics at the University of Rwanda, specialized in political economics and communication and management, as well as a very keen debater on development issues, politics, media, and economics. Thank you so much for being there. And we have Dr. Tim Gallimore, an independent researcher in genocide justice and genocide prevention, and a former spokesperson for the prosecutor of ICTR. Again, on the show, we have Galoba Mutebi. Mr. Galoba Mutebi, thank you so much for being there. Political scientist and anthropologist, independent, and a researcher, a commentator on public affairs, educated at Makerere University and the London School of Economics. And we have Colin Haber, editor of the New Times, just smart and short. Thank you so much for being there. We will be talking about media and politics in general, and look at the approach of the international media when they are talking about Africa in general, and giving the portrait of the African country. We will get your views very shortly, but before, let's look at what other journalists have said.
When I got to see the BBC documentary, all I can say, it is like it's a propaganda tool, because you can see like it is one-sided, it's biased. Even the information that is being passed on, you really see there's a motive, and it's so sad that the motive is actually affecting whatever the person who did it aimed at doing. It is actually like hurting the Rwandans, because they know what happened. They are the ones who faced the consequences. They are still hurting based on what happened in the 1994 genocide. So I believe it's so unfair that a journalist, someone who's a journalist, who's supposed to be caring about the interest of the general people or the ethics of journalism, the things you're supposed to respect.
In my opinion, the documentary is more political than journalistically professional. I wonder whether she could dare to make a similar documentary about the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide and still be alive and kicking. Huh? Just because it's about Africans, Rwandans, Tutsis, she can say whatever she wants about them. Genocide is not something you can distort as you please. Genocide is not agriculture or football, so you cannot discuss it in whatever way you prefer. Genocide is indisputable. It shouldn't be distorted. It even becomes another problem when you intentionally distort it.
Thank you so much to the journalists that have accepted to give their views, and I would like to know what you think. How do you feel the international media actually portrays Africa? I'll start with you, Mr. Charles.
Yeah, thank you. To me, there's nothing strange about the international media, the way they portray Africa. It is rooted in the history of political colonialism and neo-colonialism. So the journey has been long and is still on. So there used to be, during the Cold War, certain terminologies that were ascribed to those kind of reporting, sometimes called the colonial media imperialism, and so on. But now, if you look at the global forces of economics and politics, vying for power and control of the resources, the tool that you can use at most is the media. So there's nothing strange, really, that their journey to control the resources of Africa is still on.
Yeah, but how is it portrayed exactly? Is there some sort of negative portrayal, or is it actually good?
No. It depends on who's looking at it. If an African looks at it, it's terribly negative and very destructive.
Okay.
If you're on the other side, it is hallelujah.
Okay, well, let's go on the other side with Tim. What do you feel about this? Like when you're watching international media, you know, these big media houses and the way they can showcase one specific African country or an African issue, does it feel fair? Is it okay? Is it nice? How is it?
Well, there's not a sophisticated understanding about Africa in general outside of the continent, and even the United States, that has a lot of access to resources and information of all kinds, but there's a framing issue. For example, there tends not to be a distinction between the countries in Africa.
Yes,
and so some of the reporting for kind of short term to catch the audience's attention makes no distinction. For example, the current issue of Ebola.
Yeah.
In West Africa, and if you go to United States and many places in the world, I think the entire continent of Africa is having this problem, and the infection is rampant because they don't distinguish between the countries of Africa, or even the regions of Africa. And that's the first issue that I would say. And then this is something that I studied when I was in graduate school more than 35 years ago, and one of the books that was very prominent then, the title was Coups and Earthquakes. And the categorization of international coverage, particularly of Africa, has been that focus on coups, earthquakes, and all the kind of catastrophic things, negative things that sometimes do happen, but you never hear about the process news or the success stories. Certainly Rwanda has tremendous success stories to tell, but there is not that sophisticated understanding on the part of the audience nor the journalists who are coming to it to distinguish and really go deep and make the process more clear, more transparent, that it's not all just one amorphous continent and everything is negative there.
Yeah. How about you, Mr. Galoba? You're a political scientist. I mean, when you look at it, what do you see? How does it feel?
I don't watch a lot of TV, but I listen to radio.
You read newspapers?
I listen to radio and read newspapers.
Okay.
And what I see when I'm listening to the radio, for instance, for many years I have been listening to the BBC. And there is a time when I was one of those people that believed that international media were reliable and dependable. You could depend on them to know what is going on.
Did you change your mind?
I have. The older I have grown, and the more knowledgeable I have become about different places, the more I have realized that they actually only scratch the surface. They don't tell you the complex story. They give you the headlines. And in many cases, they make claims that are bigger than what they know. So they know very little, but they make it appear as if they know a great deal. Now, if you listen to any international broadcaster talking about Congo and Rwanda, they recycle one single story. Rwanda looting Congo's minerals, as if that is the story about Rwanda and Congo, because the story is much more complicated. Yes. If you trace it from the beginning, it is a very complicated story, and no one even examines the claims that are made about looting. What has been looted? Where was it looted from? What was the mechanism of the looting? Those questions are not asked. It's a simplified Rwanda goes to Congo to loot minerals, full stop. Yeah. You read newspapers, they recycle the same story. Same recycling old stories and only giving you snippets of things they have heard that may or may not be accurate. So the reporting of Africa is very, in my opinion, is very shallow. But I also will hesitate to try and paint this as if Africa is the only victim. I think that even other places are equally victims of the same phenomenon of journalists parachuting into places. There is, I will not name names, but I'll tell you, I know a BBC journalist.
You almost did, by the
Yeah, I nearly did. I know a BBC journalist who you may hear speaking from Nairobi this week, and next week he's in Estonia. And after that, they are in some other place in Asia. Yeah. And you think, what does this person actually know about these places?
Well, they travel and they discover.
Yeah, but look, we all travel. I mean, many of us, I'm sure all of us sitting here have been to different places in the world. How many of these places can we claim that we are experts at? And I think that is the other thing, is there is a certain hubris among Western journalists and even academics, claiming expertise on subjects that they barely understand.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the other problem with us Africans. We are very shy about claiming expertise on anything. But there are people in this world who become instant experts on things. It just takes 1 or 2 days or a week in a country, and suddenly they know everything about that country. And nobody questions that.
Yes.
So I think that it's also probably just the nature of journalism, and that journalism is a fast-moving, what can I call it? Reporting is fast-moving. You report things when they're hot. You have deadlines.
Yes.
So they want you to say something, and you will say whatever you have understood.
They don't mind what you're going to say, just give them a scoop.
So because there are many disasters that happen in Africa, and as Tim said, there have been coups, there have been earthquakes, these things make for easy stories. But when there are things like genocides, when there are things like civil wars, when there are things like violent changes of government, the underlying factors are never looked into. It's all simplified.
We all, according to what you just said, then we have so many of those. That's why we, as Africa, when I say we, I mean in Africa, we are always in the media, but just because Africa has so many of those bad things, because I never heard you saying any good things that could
because
be reported on.
Those are now the established story of Africa. And it is the established story of Africa is one of famines and coups and disasters. And even when things change, the media, even academia, they take very long to catch up with change.
Well, I think he has a point there. There's a point, and I would like to make some observation. About 28 years ago, when I was in the School of Journalism, actually when I started studying communication, one of the expert journalists came and was giving us a lecture, giving us a testimony of why he went to the US, because US is the most then and even now the most highly developed press. So he took a story that was talking positive issues about Africa. The editor told him, "Gentlemen, this is a very nice story, but it can't be published." Yeah. Because the audience, it can't sell. Yes. And there's no controversy, because the way we know Africa, this is not this story can't go. Yes.
So I will come back to that. Mr. Colin, when we speak of, when we're talking of stories that can sell, you're the editor of New Times, so I'm sure you know. Do you look at a story and say this can actually sell in Africa, this can sell in the international press, this can sell here and there? How do you feel when you look at those stories? Do you think the editors just want to sell, or there is another agenda that, they're looking at?
I think the biggest challenge here is that there's a stereotype. Yeah. And the image they've created is that nothing good comes out of Africa. So if there's anything good that's coming out of Africa, it tends to be trashed. So that is what we are beginning to see come back. Before, if it's good stories, they don't care. No one covers what is going on in Africa. But once a story is feeding into that stereotype comes up, they all rush here. Galimo gave a good example of Ebola in West Africa. I was watching a Western media house, I don't want to name names, and one of the topics they were discussing was, should the US ban flights from Africa?
Africa.
Yes. And that showed how ignorant these people are. Yeah. And just by looking at the map, there's a graphic that is going around and placing the places infected with Ebola in a different color to the rest of Africa, and it's very shocking. Yeah. So that stereotype is a big challenge we have to deal with, and we keep seeing it coming. Okay. The challenge now is that with the 24-hour news channel, with the 24-hour news cycle, it has become more complicated.
Yeah. Because it comes and goes and comes back again and again and again. Or why is it more complicated now?
Yeah, because you have to feed the demand for news. right?
Yes.
So you're just recycling the same old things to cater for that demand.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to add
I want
something?
to follow up on a point my colleague made about that it's not only this part of the world that has negative portrayal, but it has disproportionate impact on this part of the world. For example, what you just mentioned about decisions that might be taken outside of a country or outside of the continent of Africa, which even though you may not have perfect reporting in other regions, when other countries or institutions interact with countries in Africa, it has a greater impact. For example, the banning of flights from the entire continent of Africa would have tremendous economic impact, where you don't have a sophisticated understanding and differentiation. If they decided to ban flights to all of Europe, those European countries could survive that decision a lot better than countries in Africa. So even though there is negative reporting in other places, it tends to be much more damaging, and the consequence of that negative reporting tends to be much more damaging on African countries.
What does that do to the general public perception about Africa in general? Is it terrible? Like, when you travel, do you feel like they have no idea, or they think Africa is all bad, or how does it feel? Do you feel that when you travel, Colin? Like when you get out of this country?
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah?
Yeah, like someone meets you and is like, oh, you're from Rwanda, is everything okay? And you know, and you get so surprised because you're from a place there's absolutely nothing wrong. You're actually much safer than, let's say, in the streets of
Washington, D.C.
I mean, New York, or you know, you don't know what exactly is going to happen.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
I remember there was a time I was feeling cold. Traveled to the US, and I had this jumper with, you know, with a hoodie on, and then I just entered the store, and then the store attendant came and he was like, why don't you pick what you want and leave the store? You know, so there's already that image that has been created, and I don't know if it is racism because we're black, so probably they perceive that, you know, whatever comes out from this part of the world is probably negative. So the news, what the news is doing is just feeding into that kind of thing.
While you're at it now, what do African media houses do about it? Because there is such a thing like perception. It's a negative perception, but there is doing something about the negative perception probably to change. Like, say, the media house you work with, what do you do to change that kind of perception? Do you feel like there is need to do that? Do we need to prove anything anyway?
I think what we are beginning to see is people are beginning to read content from Africa, and that's one of the biggest advantages of the internet. It has made the world a little bit smaller. So if someone is looking for a specific story or is doing research or something like that, and we also monitor the people who quote our newspaper, and you know, they'll always say, according to the New Times, this is what is going on. However, they'll always put in that however, as if, you know, this is an African media, it reports this way. But we believe the more we report these stories, the more we tell our own stories, the impact will slowly, you know, catch up and spread.
Catch up and change. Mr. Goloba, do you feel like, let's say, a story about Ebola or insecurity, about corruption, let's say Africa is being showcased in a negative way, one specific country in Africa, and it's very unfair. You can see it and you can tell. Should other Africans feel concerned? Or let's say specifically on the media, is it a point of concern for everyone in Africa?
Well, I wish that it was. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I'm very familiar with the African media scene, and I read some of the major publications. Now, if we pick one controversy about Africa and look at what newspapers in Africa are writing, unfortunately they tend to parrot their Western counterparts. It is as if, and I keep having this conversation with African journalists here in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and I always wonder, why is it that it looks to me as if to be a good journalist or to be a respectable African journalist, you have to do certain standard things. So if you use the language that your Western counterparts use, referring to your own government as a regime rather than a government, calling African leaders thieves or dictators in very flippant ways. So if, as a researcher, there are subjects that I research in depth and get to know, including the complex sides of these stories. Now, when the media write about them, including African media, they are so shallow in the way they treat these subjects. And if you ask them, why would you write about this in this kind of way? Now, sometimes they'll give you the excuse that they're journalists. They don't have the time or even the resources to research these things in depth, and therefore they shouldn't be treated like researchers.
Okay.
And I will tell you, for instance, I don't want to jump the gun, but if you look at this documentary that we are here to discuss, if you look at regional media in the Great Lakes region, which major newspaper in this region has put the BBC to task about what the BBC
We'll
did?
come back to that.
They didn't. So
we'll discuss.
African media are not doing what I think they should be doing, which is to challenge the stereotypical images of Africa coming from Western media.
Yes, on the stereotype, I'll come back to you and ask you what you think about the whole international media thinking or feeling, or some of them, just to be correct, feeling like the media in Africa is controlled by the political power. We'll come back to that, but Tim, you had something to add.
I cannot resist to follow up on my colleague's observation about the parroting of Western media, and at least the African media that I have been consuming, a lot of it in East Africa, in particular the New Times, your publication, and I'm agreeing with you in a very strong way, and maybe in a very critical way. Not only the news coverage is following some of the less than stellar things that you see, but I'm really quite shocked and revolted when I see in the New Times a story about the Kardashian and Justin Bieber and all the things that we try to get away from in the U.S. I come and I find it here. And so it's not just how you do journalism, but the taste and the trends and things that you follow. And I would say, you know, as trivial as that is, we want to kick that out. And I come and I see it here on your front page, and I'm really taken aback by it. Well, so yes, I agree with my colleague very much about this influence that the Western media have on shaping not just the serious reporting, but even cultural entertainment. There's this gravitation towards it that is perhaps not the healthiest thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Justin Bieber, just to mention, if he has the biggest Twitter following more than anybody.
I just want to make some observation on that point.
Yes.
I think we have to look at the mission of the media. You see, the media, the international media, has already created some perceptions among Africans, just like our education system. So that perception goes a long way to serve the foreign interest. If you dare to challenge that kind of perception, then there's going to be a crisis. And this goes the same way because the media has a purpose. It has a political purpose, it has economic purpose. Politically, it has to influence so that you think likewise, you think in their terms. Then economically, you also have to serve their interest because it propagates, it's more or less like advertisement. So that's why media has to grow with industries, where you have see country developing, you have media mushrooming coming up. So that interest that the media serves is what is at stake, and that's what causes the trouble. Now, even then, when you look at our economies, our states in Africa, they are an appendage of the foreign powers. They have to serve, their subservience, they serve certain purpose and interest. If they don't confirm, then they will have it.
I'd like to hear your view, maybe, about this. The African media being controlled by the political power, or
I'm not sure.
Our political powers being controlled by the Western, so we...
Well, I think that's, again, a fine example of propaganda put out by Western media, that somehow media in Africa are controlled by governments and things of that kind. Now,
it's his thing.
So Western media, even as they pretend to be independent, they reflect the views of their governments. Even as they pretend that they are independent, actually they are not. They promote the interests of their own governments. And one could even say that the ruling elite in Western countries and journalists are one and of the same kind. So they support each other in ways that are very subtle, that if you're not sophisticated enough to notice, you will buy into the propaganda that they're independent. I'm sorry, they're not. They are promoters of imperialism. They are promoters of the worst kind of Western domination over poor countries. So, and I'll tell you again, Colin is here. When I listen to somebody like Philippe Reintjens, this Belgian very anti-Rwanda academic, if he's talking about the New Times, he says, oh, this government-controlled propaganda newspaper, you see?
Yes.
But Philippe Reintjens will never speak in the same terms about a Belgian newspaper that is writing nonsense about Africa. Uninformed nonsense.
Yes.
So I think that, it's propaganda that we should be able to see through, but we don't always see through it.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add to what he said. I don't think that's about to change, the propaganda role played by the media and the media supporting their whatever governments. But if we look at about 50 years ago, there was a good example that came out in Kenya when they were trying to gain their independence. So the colonialists at that time, they would distribute the press briefings. And what they were trying to play up were two things. One, that Africans are primitive and irrational. And two, the African leaders who were refusing to take what these people are saying are actually savage. You know, so that we keep seeing that coming up. Even the example Mr. Golova has just given. At one time you're best friends, but the moment you don't agree with what you're saying, you all of a sudden become savage. So this has been going on for some time. It's not really something new, but you can see the traces to the colonial era and the fight for independence.
All right, Tim, do you want to add something on that?
Very direct answer to your question about the independence of the media. I'm going to, again, harken back to my graduate school days. There was a professor of mine, Herbert Allschuh, who wrote a book, and I helped him do some of the research. And the title of the book is Agents of Power. And through that book, it traces every single government system. The media in that government system supports the agents of power. And then another layer you have on that is, as you said correctly, as a society matures economically, the media tends to mature also. But then you change one agent of power for the other, where the business concern and the business class tends to be the power that manipulates. So in every society, in every time, historically, the media have served as agents of those in power. Okay,
well, since we're talking about these stereotypes that we see whenever we're watching, TV. I watch TV, Mr. Golova. A lot of TV. So when we're watching TV or listening to the radio, reading the newspaper, what we see, like an African leader is corrupt, an African leader favorites, like some sort of favoritism around the members of his family, does all wrong stuff, no systems in the country, and they tend to make it look uniform. And they're trying to pick on every country, on like any other African country should have something similar. Do you have the same feeling, or you be a little bit emotional about that?
I think there's a very significant departure. Overall, that's probably a correct characterization. But for a few presidents in Africa, including President Paul Kagame, there's a departure because he, like Julius Nyerere back in the 60s, had a different philosophy and a different relationship with the external agents of power. It talks about self-reliance. It talks about dignity and standing up and doing for yourself. That is perceived as a great threat in the West because of the dependency that has been created and the kind of appendage of political leaders here for however it develops. So when there's someone out of the mold, that person in that country will tend to get a bit more of press, not because something negative happened, but something good for that country and good for those people, but it challenges the international world economic and political order.
All right.
Just to add to what he was saying, there's an example. There's an example that Andrew Wall is someone we interviewed last month about the BBC documentary. He gave us an example of how a documentary about Rwanda 17, R17, that was the soccer team, and how, the 17-year-olds have managed to cope up, and now this team has gotten to the level of qualifying for the World Cup under that group. So it was a perfect documentary telling an excellent story that would make Rwanda look good. So Willis was telling us that 24 hours to the documentary being aired, it was spiked. It was pulled off the schedule. And the reason, there was a clip of President Kagame smiling. So you can imagine.
He's not supposed to be happy.
That is not the image they would like to portray. And whoever made that decision, I highly suspect that at the back of their minds, they don't want to portray a certain image. So those kind of things, right? And this is something totally different. This is a soccer team. It's nothing political or anything. It's just a good story of kids who are making it, Yes. So those kind of things are the ones that really make us suspicious about the different agendas of the media houses.
Yeah, well, they paint a picture. More in radio, so we say that you're supposed to paint a picture. When you're talking to people, you're supposed to paint some picture in their minds.
Yeah, there is this issue of media sets the agenda. And that also corresponds to international economic and political order. Now, those two things go hand in hand. The international political and economic order that is set, which is revised time and again, the media has to go along with it to propagate the intention of them. That's exactly, if they see any African country trying to come up, they will definitely have to put it down.
Yeah.
Even if you try to develop, to them is a challenge. And therefore, they have maneuvers. They have the way they do their own things. Create a new perception, change the attitude, tune if they see that you're going to, or if they see that the perception is going to go, they create another one. And that's the role of the media. And like I said earlier, the media etiquette, part of even entertainment, is part of the changing your perception.
Yes.
You are entertained to look and behave in a Western style. You are educated to speak very good English, perfect accent, the mannerism.
Well, what's perfect?
Well,
they are perfect.
In their own judgment.
Yes.
Then that goes along with the economy. Now, if an African country tries to come out of that or to pose some kind of a challenge,
it's a risk. It's a threat.
It's
All
a
right.
threat.
Well, even in countries where there are success stories on development, in economics, in good security index, the low rate of crimes, good investment, women emancipation, there is always something to say, and that's what we are going to go to shortly, gentlemen. And thank you so much again for being there. Shortly, a focus on the BBC documentary Rwanda, The Untold Story, coming up after the break.
imyaka 7 tudahinga
umudozi mfite aturiye twishyuye amafaranga yacu
ndarya ibintu bitagira isupu
ntabwo yavomaga amazi
uzanshakira